Let's jump in. Let's get the discussion started. My name, for all of you who don't know, my name is Bryan Haley. I produce Church Juice. We are a program that helps churches with communication and with marketing. And as part of everything that's going on with coronavirus, with racial justice, with everything that's happening right now, we felt it was important to stop and pause and have this conversation now about racial reconciliation in the church and what that looks like. How do churches communicate that? And so I brought on my co-host on the Church Juice podcast, Jeanette, and some of our friends, some acquaintances, new friends to join us on this panel today. Couple things before we get started. If you are watching along and you have questions, feel free to throw it in on the chat. We'd love to spend some time at the end doing Q&A, and we'll make sure to get to as many of those questions as we can. Let's start off with some introductions. So, Jeanette, you're my co-host. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, hello. As you said, my name is Jeanette, and one of the hats I wear is co-host for the Church Juice podcast, but I also wear the hat of being the communications manager and a strategy specialist for Caston Church, which is a software texting and email platform for churches, and we provide solutions to help churches connect with their members and guests and their communities. So, and then I have other hats too, but we'll just keep it at that.
Awesome. I forgot to mention, I am here at Madison Square Church in Grand Rapids. So thank you, Madison Square, for allowing me to host this here. I chose to host this webinar, this discussion here today, because Madison Church is seeking anti-racism in the city of Grand Rapids, and they are leading the cause. And so we wanted to honor that a little bit and bring that element into the conversation too. Let's continue with introductions. Sherri, you're first on my screen. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sherri Jones. I'm based in New Jersey, founder of Sherri Jones Media Group, where I service churches and for-profit businesses, helping them align their marketing and branding to reach their target demographics.
Awesome. Jeanette, you want to go through the rest of the panelists?
Well, I am pleased to welcome a couple of people that I know as well. So I would love for us to get to meet Pastor, our digital pastor, Reverend Marcus Cyler. Marcus, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please? Other than we love the Apple Watch.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Jeanette. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marcus Cyler. It looks like a C, but pronounced K, basically. But anyway, I was a former pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I was a pastor for about 5 years. Also a denominational officer within the church, and stepped away to focus on digital ministry. And so I provide digital ministry on a consultancy basis for churches and for pastors who need help with, as I like to call, navigating the ever-changing digital ministry landscape. Just helping churches with just all things digital, all things digital ministry, and not necessarily just always with the tools, but also helping people to understand how to think about digital ministry. I actually got a doctor of ministry in church communications and studying the role that social media plays in building community. So that's definitely a passion of mine and something I like to help whoever I work with in that area specifically.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We're all glad you're here, Marcus. Thank you for joining us. And we also are joined by Sandee Jackson of 2911 Creative. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, it's a scripture reference. So yeah.
Yes.
So I'm Sandee with 2911 Creative. I work primarily with nonprofits and churches, and I, at home here in Charleston, where I live, I'm affiliated most closely with Morris Brown African Methodist Episcopal Church, where I'm a member.
Well, thank you for joining us. And next on my list is Pastor Daryl Scarborough. Now, I'm assuming that that's Boss Church, which I love the name, but you can feel free, Daryl, to share more about your church or your affiliations. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. I am in the midst of moving around, so I am on audio only. But yes, it is Boss Church. That is actually the name of it.
Love it.
Yes, everybody seems to love that name. And so I am in Sacramento, California, and a close friend of Jason and Caston, and he invited me and reached out to Bryan, and Bryan invited me to be a part of the conversation. So would love to be a part of it. We do a lot of work in Sacramento towards racial reconciliation. The church is about 60% African-American, 30% white, and the remaining is Hispanic and Asian. So a diverse church. And so we've had a lot of interesting times these recent days. So glad to be a part of the conversation.
Well, we're glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And now we are going to hear from Reverend Jermaine Richardson from Bethel AME Church. Welcome, Reverend Richardson.
Thank you. I'm Jermaine Richardson. I'm a native of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, but I've been here in Alabama since 2008 as a pastor. I do pastor Bethel AME Church in the city of Birmingham. I've been there a relatively short time. I was appointed in November of last year. Before that, I pastored in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I also serve as the executive director of the Daniel Payne Foundation, which is also headquartered in Birmingham. And our work concerns mainly workforce development and essential skills training for those who are in marginalized communities. But my primary work is at Bethel Church.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And we are glad to have you as well. And then last, but definitely not least on my list, is another friend of mine, Jason Caston. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, what's going on? Jason Caston, author and founder of the iChurch Method, former digital specialist, the Potter's House and Daystar TV, and all your other favorite ministries. Working with Boss, me and Daryl go back about 30 years. So when he say we're good friends, like playing basketball in the driveway as kids' friends. And look forward to joining the conversation. Have had quite a few conversations in this space from the church communicator perspective, as well as just helping people understand and educate about the history of things that are going on. So looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thank you for joining us, all of you. I'm so glad that you're here today, and I'm looking forward to diving into this conversation. Bryan, you want to kick it off?
Sure.
Tossing it back to you.
That's right. So I think before we start talking about the practical side of what does racial reconciliation and church communications look like, it's probably important for us to spend some time kind of laying the foundation. So one of the first questions that I want to throw out to all of you and see what you have to add to that conversation is the question of Black Lives Matter. So can you explain the whole movement behind Black Lives Matter, and what does that mean in response to or in comparison to the All Lives Matter argument?
I'll kick it off here, I guess. The Black Lives Matter movement came about because, as you can see in various news stories, they weren't valuable to people in general. It wasn't a only Black Lives Matter movement. It was more of a Black Lives Matter too. So I think the two gets lost in conversation. We're not saying that all, other lives don't matter. We're trying to make our presence known that we matter as well. We matter just as much as white lives do. So the All Lives Matter movement, in essence, it sounds nice, but clearly all lives do not matter. So Black people had to separate themselves to make it known.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely had to separate, and then we had to find ourselves continually having to justify why we mattered. So not only do we matter, but why we mattered. And so as things started to get filmed, we started to speak on certain things where we thought these were injustices that we knew about in our community, but they started to get filmed. And so we thought with them being filmed, that there were justices that we would start to see. And when that didn't occur, we started to say Black Lives Matter because of the things that were starting to come out that we thought would showcase and be apparent that they did matter, but that wasn't the case. And so as we continued to have to justify and film and justify and watch people who we thought would be brought to justice be able to walk free after doing things to Black people that we would not have the privilege to be able to do, then we said, okay, we have to speak on the Black Lives Matter. And then in response to that came the All Lives Matter retort, as well as even the Blue Lives Matter retort. And therefore we realized that we have a situation here where this movement is trying to be hijacked to not focus on that Black Lives Matter, and it's now trying to be made into something that it's not. And again, here we are justifying not only the movement, but back to the point of the Black people that we're talking about and the injustices that were happening in society and have been historically.
I think one of the things that I kind of want to challenge just a little bit is not so much the idea of justification that Black Lives Matter, because from the very beginning, it was really kind of calling into focus why it was that there was this discrepancy or dichotomy between how the world, and particularly American society, responded to incidences of clashes or encounters between police in particular and white persons versus Black persons. And so I think the automatic assumption became, if we say Black Lives Matter, it is being received by the majority that Black Lives Matter exclusively above anyone else. And that's never been the case. It is calling to reality the fact that if there is dichotomy in the ways in which justice is meted out in this society, the most accessible means of calling out that dichotomy is to say, look at what happens with Black people versus the majority in terms of our interactions with law enforcement, in terms of how we have access to healthcare, the particular burdens that are experienced within the minority communities that are completely overlooked by the majority. And in particular, since we're in Christian context having this conversation, how those matters, those issues might be addressed in one particular historical context, the context that I come from, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, versus how it is addressed or not addressed in other religious contexts. So I think that just the drawing the distinction between how these particular incidences are observed and critiqued is really what drew the comparison between Black lives versus all lives. No one ever said only Black lives, but the assumption was because we put Black first that we were excluding anybody else.
Well, I really appreciate you all sharing that. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about that particular comparison between All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter? I know that's something that has been confusing for many of people I am around and see often. And I really appreciate, Jason, something that you said as well, that there was, with the advent of the, people getting recordings and people seeing this stuff more, there was this assumption that things would change because this was more out in the open. And I think it says something deeper, and we're going to get into a little bit of this systematic racism here in a minute, but that's something that has been hard to swallow as well, just watching that. So I appreciate you bringing that up as well. The next question, or the next thing that we want to talk about, is the idea of, or the concept of, white privilege. We have some people joining us here today on participants, some people watching. And can you just define, any of you feel free to jump in, what is white privilege and what it is not? and maybe help us understand a little bit more about how to learn about that and understand what it is.
If I could, I would actually be interested in hearing what you all think it is, because there is going to be some distance, and perhaps if we're going to stay on the bleeding edge of the learning experience, let's hear from you what your understanding of it is. I think one of the things that is perhaps unfortunate about the composition of the panel is that we don't have other non-hosts that are not Black that might be able to engage based upon their level of understanding. So I guess it does fall to Bryan and Jeanette, but I'd like to hear how you define it, and then we can kind of go back and forth there.
Bryan, would you like to go first?
Sure. So, sidebar, I'm also curious, in light of, I don't know if all of you are aware of this, but in light of Louis Giglio's kind of conversation and talk of white privilege, I'm curious.
It's not a white blessing, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious how you responded to that, because even as I was just reading it, I just kind of cringed. So so I was just curious, but I think Sherri, you stepped into that.
I actually do have a response for that. That's actually going to tie into answering the question about what I believe, not just what white privilege is, but what it isn't. But I did want to hear what you guys had to say first, and then I have something to add about that.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, and I was talking about this morning, white privilege is basically how privileged I am just because of the color of my skin. So because of the color of my skin, I was born into certain dynamics and certain elements of culture that as I continue to learn, I continue to understand that people of color, Black people and other people of color, don't have those same opportunities, the same elements of freedom and rights that I have been afforded the opportunity to own, to have.
Yeah, so my understanding and acceptance of my own white privilege has been something that has evolved over, the course of my reality that it existed versus my walking around my life willy-nilly. But the more I have explored the concept of white privilege, I've come to really feel like, and I didn't make up this definition, but I really, this particular one is one that really sets with me, is that it's not that I never had any struggles in my life, but my struggles have not come because of the color of my skin. And so for me, my white privilege is that what my life circumstance, similar to what Bryan has said, has not been hindered in any way because of the color of my skin. I've had other problems in my life, but probably was helped out by the color of my skin. And so when I think about my own white privilege, I think more of how the color of my skin did not cause any, it has not been the cause of any of my, negative circumstances. You may have a more deeper understanding even than I do of it, but that's why we're here, is because we want to be able to have this conversation. And Jermaine, I just want to thank you for putting us on the spot.
Definitely. I'll admit I was not expecting that one.
Yeah, that's what we need.
Yeah, I think that was actually a good start off to the conversation, because I know in this conversation I've had before about what white privilege is, it's exactly kind of how you laid it out, Jeanette, as far as those things. And then I definitely want to get to what you brought up, Bryan, about that conversation about the white blessing. Yeah. But one of the things I found interesting about white privilege, and not so much as defining it, because that part we kind of got to. One of the things in the riot, one of the I won't say riots, protests I saw, that was a way to looking at white privilege as not so much as, equating it with white guilt, but utilizing privilege as allies, utilizing privilege as a way to help the cause. Is I was watching this protest happen, and as the police were approaching a group of people, they said, white wall to the front. And all of the white protesters came to the front and formed a wall between them and the cops, the protesters and the police. And the police stopped. And that right there was a great example of how white privilege can be utilized in a way that, look, if you know the game and you know the system, then utilize it to the advantage of the people that you're trying to help. And I'm just going to go out and guess here, but I'm pretty sure black wall or brown wall might not have been as effective, but that white wall, I'm telling you, that made the police stop. It was an interesting aspect of watching the police play the old game of red light, green light. And for some reason, white wall was red light, and they stopped, and they were much more they were obviously less likely to come in and do the things that we would see that would cause harm to the protesters. And so that was an example of where I see white privilege being shown, being utilized to the benefit of the protesters and just the benefit of the people, of allies helping the others.
And actually, Jason, that was an excellent example of the epitome of white privilege. And just to piggyback on that, you talk about the idea of utilizing your white privilege, and I don't know if everybody understands what it means to utilize your white privilege or step into that. But I wanted to talk about that in light of I think the question was posed about what white privilege is and what it isn't, and I wanted to focus specifically on what it isn't, because I think that in understanding what it isn't, then I think we can get to some other understandings as well. When I heard that, like what white privilege isn't, it triggered me immediately to think about something that I want us all to think about. When we as Black people talk about white privilege and about white people having white privilege, we're not, and I don't want to speak for everybody, so maybe I should just speak for myself. But I know that when I talk about white privilege, I'm not doing it as an insult. We're not saying it in any kind of derogatory terms, or we're not, or I'm not criticizing you for having your white privilege. It is just a factor of living in America, and it's not necessarily something that I believe at this point people need to feel guilty about. I think that it's most beneficial as of right now to just understand the existence of it and how to use it to help, rather than trying to deny that it exists in the first place. And that denial of it, or the mentality that talking about white privilege is somehow derogatory, I think that is what got Louis Giglio in trouble in the first place, is thinking about it from such a negative place that it allowed him to kind of talk out of turn about it. Because when you talk about it, it doesn't have to be negative. It's just an acknowledgement of America's original sin and the benefit that white people have because of it, and how you can use it to further to further I'm losing my words, but basically help to facilitate healing in light of it. So if we can think of it as something that is not an insult, but just a fact of life, then I think that that's something that could maybe be beneficial, and so that people don't have to think of it as negative or something that they have to excuse away.
And just in very practical terms, Jeanette and Bryan, I don't know if you guys have children, nieces, nephews, or cousins, but if they go for a walk in your neighborhood, I'm sure you don't have the fear that they may not come back because something may happen. You don't have that anxiety, right? Or if you apply for a job, you're not worried, oh my God, I might not get it because I'm white. If you're going on a family vacation, you may not have to Google the area you're going to see how they treat white people. That's a very practical explanation of the privilege that we're referring to. Because those are things that we do fear. I have a niece and nephew, and living in a suburban neighborhood, it's like, okay, be careful, guys. Or if they go somewhere with their friends, text me as soon as you get there. Text me when you're on your way back, because it's a real fear and it's a real anxiety that we have.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Was that Jason? Did you have something to add?
Oh, the thing I was gonna add was just about the comment about the Giglio and the white blessing. I was gonna say it's a using privilege for good definitely helps, and we discussed that, but it's a privileged perspective to be able to say, slavery was a blessing in any way, sort, or manner, and the country that come from it became whatever the country became because it. In essence, it became a great place for, your lineage, your people. It became a great place. And not until recently, for a lot of allies who are just saying, hey, I didn't know it was this bad. It's not that Black people of color haven't been saying that the country has had issues for years. It's just that we waved the magic civil rights wand, and racism all of a sudden went away for certain people. But again, back in those times, the polls and the statistics showed that things weren't as bad as back then, coloreds. Things weren't as bad as coloreds said it they were. They were just complaining. Coloreds had it okay. But they were complaining, so we had to do the civil rights thing to calm them down. And now, here we go, 20, 30, 50 years later, and Blacks are still complaining, so things, and they don't think things are as bad. So it's a privileged place to say, put blessing and slavery in the same sentence. And that in itself is just, unfortunately, there's verbal gymnastics that we've seen. Verbal and mental gymnastics that we've seen from certain non-marginalized people to justify, whether it be privilege or justify certain current administrations or justify certain things that happen in America because it fits their lifestyle and their comfort zone, and they don't want to look at things from anyone else's perspective. They have this tunnel vision of how America is. And for them, America is and continues to be great.
And just to add to what Jason said, to put the timeline in perspective, my grandparents lived through the civil rights movement. So we aren't talking about going way back down my family tree. This isn't something that happened so long ago. They have stories about color and whites, and they have stories about going to march and water hoses and not being able to sit at certain counters in restaurants and not being welcome. This isn't, when we say slavery, I know sometimes the mind goes back to history textbooks. This is all very recent. Because if you go back to great-grandparents, they were slaves. So this isn't, something that's as far removed as people like to make it seem.
So we've talked a lot about kind of the history, the systemic issues, I guess, with racism in the United States. What does that look like in the church? Can you guys give some insight into how racism plays a role in the American church?
Yes, I don't want to keep talking, so if anybody else, but I do have an answer. Okay, so I'll go. Racism, the church has a race issue because the church does not speak about race, especially white churches. White pastors act like racism does not exist, and they do not acknowledge the original sin that Marcus alluded to, which is racism. They sweep it under the rug. It's like it never happened. we're here in our perfect, church building with our perfect, songs, and it doesn't exist. They block it out. That's wrong, because there's a group of oppressed people. And what would Jesus have done if he saw a group of oppressed people? He would have helped them. But the church, especially the white church, just dismisses it because it's not their problem directly, when in reality, it really is.
So I think if you look at what recently happened with the SBC and them speaking on, what was that, J.D. Greer speaking on the history of the denomination and how Christianity was used to justify slavery and racism, and people who considered themselves Christians had no problems with lynchings, Jim Crow, KKK, blacks sitting in the back of the church, because they were not allowed near the whites. So I think that as the church initially, American church started off, they were fine with having their different the way they did church and still having it separate from any racist ideologies. And because I believe that blacks were less than people. So if they're less than people, then they don't have to look at them as if it's a sin to do these things that they did to them, because they're less than people. All right. I mean, they're barely above 3/5. Okay. So that's what it is. So if we get to the point where as things continue to progress, we already knew it was common knowledge to say Sunday was the most segregated day in the nation. We knew
still
that.
Is. Mm-hmm.
Still is. So we knew that part. And we would say that, not realizing that part of the reasons that was because the racist foundation of the church and the ways that things got. And the church wouldn't even acknowledge it. So to even see the Southern Baptist Convention, which they had a huge issue a couple years back, even just acknowledging anything racial, to the point where now they're acknowledging the history of it and even calling it sinful is a step in the right direction. But the church has never tried to acknowledge how Christianity was used to justify a lot of the racism and racist tendencies all the way back through slavery and colonialism and indoctrination that started from the European perspective of Christianity and moved across the world. So that's just how it's been. And so now we're at the point where we see certain churches, whether if they're a white church, if they're a black church, if they're a mixed church, have to look at racism from different perspectives. And especially if it's a white church, they usually don't want to speak on it because either they'll lose members, the pastor might lose his job because the congregation doesn't agree with what he said, all those type of negative things, because it's not a part of their reality, and they want to hope that it's going to just magically go away.
So Pastor Daryl, you made a point of mentioning that your church in Sacramento is multicultural, and you mentioned some of the different races that are represented there. I'm curious how you, as a pastor and as a church, as Boss Church, how you guys are actively promoting anti-racism and multicultural Christianity at Boss.
With the help of Jesus and all of his angels. It is a daunting task, and to be transparent, many times it is seemingly impossible to pull off. And the reason I'm say that to you is because people struggle to grasp the truth that there are realities outside of their own. And so when you have churches that are diverse, first thing we have to understand is that diversity in church has just recently become this sexy thing. So everybody wants to say their church is diverse. Nobody talks about that while the church may have different skin tones, they are not multicultural. They have the same culture. And so Boss has some tension often because we are not just simply multiple skin colors and backgrounds, but it is also multicultural. So you have people from completely different ideologies gathering in one space. Typically, it is easy on Sunday because on Sunday, it is simply them engaging in a presentation. They hear the word preached, they hear songs sang, they chat for a little bit with each other, and they leave. They're not forced to step into each other's lives. This is where it becomes difficult, because when the world shifts and the world forces the church to deal with topics that we often don't want to deal with, you get a lot of tension and you get a lot of conflict. So in this current climate I've been dealing with, and I've done a whole series on Black lives and who Black people are, how we got to America, and the church's role in a lot of it. And the Black folk at the church have loved it. My white brothers and sisters at the church have struggled greatly with it. It has made them uncomfortable. They're asking, why are we talking about this? Why are we discussing this? And it goes back to what I initially started to say. The difficulty in it is that people struggle to realize that there's another world other than what they've experienced. So when you consider those that live in a space of white privilege, oftentimes they struggle with Black Lives Matter. They struggle with these things that they see because they're saying, how is this even possible? A police officer has never treated me like this. This cannot be real. They must be lying. They must be making this up. And the same thing happens in church. You have people that are looking at each other across the aisle, and now they're saying, so you're telling me my life is not encompassing of all of reality? And so that is the tension that we often face. And I'll give you a quick particular example. The balance in our church has always been weird in that we support the police. So we have part of our church that consistently goes out, feeds the police officers in our community, take them food on holidays, sit with them, hang out with them. But we also have a social justice ministry in our church. And there is a racial divide in those two ministries. Most of the Black members of the church will never go and do the police ministry. And those that do the police ministry never touch the social justice area. And so the struggle of a pastor, at least in my role, is to keep bringing people to the table to have these conversations when people's tendency is to avoid conflict. And to be honest with you, I think part of the issue with white privilege is no one's ever forced you to be uncomfortable. And I'm not talking about you in particular, but no one's ever forced the majority of white people to be uncomfortable. Yeah. So when we are saying, let's have this conversation, a lot of my white members and brothers and sisters I know and love will just back away from it because they don't want to be uncomfortable. Whereas Black folk, we've been raised in discomfort. We live in discomfort. We breathe discomfort. And so we're like, why you don't want to have a conversation? Come on, let's talk this out. What you scared of? And they back up and they retreat. And so, just being transparent, I've lost more white members over the last couple of years than anything. Our church has grown, but that's because we've gotten Black and brown and even some Asian folk that have come. But by white folk, a lot of them have kind of begun to dissipate. So it's an ongoing tension. And, you try it with the help of Jesus, but sometimes you do wonder, is it even possible? Just because human beings struggle to realize that there's a whole other reality outside of what they experience.
So for the whole panel, trying to figure out how to ask this. Well, I guess what solutions would you say the church needs to provide as a church, not even just as a white church, but what solutions should we be providing to help promote anti-racism in our congregations and in our culture?
So, Bryan, I want to challenge you because I think in the anti-racism discussion, the burden should not be placed on Black churches.
For sure.
Absolutely.
We're Black every single day of our lives. So this isn't our fight, to fight. I think this fight is one for the white church to put their boxing gloves on and to tackle. And if you lose members, you lose members. But at the end of the day, we all read the same Bible. Jesus is Jesus. We worship the same God, and he would not stand up for racism. So I think it's time for the white church to call their congregants to repent and to understand and to mourn with us. I attend Impact Church here in New Jersey, where my bishop is DeAndre Salter, and he's been in this series, Better People. And it comes down to, if you're going to be uncomfortable with dividing the word of truth, then find another church. Mm-hmm. The word makes you uncomfortable sometimes, no matter what type of sin you're discussing. It's no different for racism. So the white church needs to tackle this, not in a creative way, not in a roundabout way. It's a discussion that needs to be had very openly and very frankly. They need to repent.
Yeah, and one of the questions that we got was, what do you do with a white church, who doesn't want to hear about racism, and they continue to sweep it under the rug and Their pastor may even lose their job if they were to speak out against racism. How would you recommend that a church handles those types of situations?
Find another church.
I think, yeah, it's gonna be like you're saying, Sherri. It's gonna be some one. This is gonna be a marathon. This is gonna be a marathon. So it's gonna be a lot of uncomfortable conversations. There are gonna be some pastors who are going to have to choose a side. Unfortunately, we've had a certain amount of time, however much time you want to count, to where we got to this point where a lot of us knew it was coming. It just happened that us who knew it was coming were Black and brown. And we knew it was going to come to a point, especially in the church, where we were going to have to address some issues that we were either going to have to say one of two things. Like, you're going to have to make some tough decisions, have some tough conversations, and choose a side. Or you're going to have to say, your God is wrong and my God is right. Okay? White Jesus is saying one thing and Black Jesus is saying another thing. We're just going to have to come along those lines and say that. And so therefore, as Daryl was saying, that's going to change some people's reality. So therefore, it's at this particular point now, there are going to be some pastors, especially white pastors in white churches, that are going to be put in uncomfortable situations that can possibly lose their congregations and lose their jobs. But we have in America, not just focus on this westernized Christianity, in America right now, we have a lot of issues, religion specifically, as well as politics, and we haven't gotten to the mix of politics and religion. We haven't gotten to that yet. But where you cannot play the middle anymore. Playing the middle was fine before. You can't play the middle anymore. And now you have to choose a side. And there are going to be consequences for either side that you choose. That's just where we're at right now.
And this
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This goes even deeper than the pastors. This goes to those multicultural churches who have no Black people in leadership. And I'm not just talking about the worship leader, but Black people as senior leaders in their congregation to lend that voice. And it also goes beyond the church. So white people who are open to having this conversation, if you're at work outside of the church and you hear somebody being racist, now's the time, like Jason was saying, it's no more, oh, well, I just won't say anything. You have to call it out. You have to call a sin a sin. Otherwise, you're accountable. So as Christians, we need to help each other be better.
I want to focus back on the idea of discomfort and talking about it and kind of dispelling the myth that it necessarily has to be a bad thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with discomfort. Racism in this country, it hasn't been comfortable. You know what I'm saying? Slavery wasn't comfortable. Nothing regarding this has been comfortable, for us. And so the idea that talks about racism and racial reconciliation now are not comfortable, that's just the reality of the situation. And it doesn't have to be comfortable. And it's not an issue that it's not comfortable. I think that some people are afraid to have, and again, I don't like to speak for other people, but I just have an idea that people don't like to have uncomfortable conversations because somehow they feel that they're going to be looked upon negatively, or there's going to be some kind of negative consequence because of discomfort, or that we as Black people are going to look at white people more negatively if you are uncomfortable. And I don't think, just speaking for me, I don't have any problem with anybody being uncomfortable. In fact, if you lean into that discomfort, I appreciate and respect you a lot more for being willing to lean into that discomfort in order to show a commitment to try to move forward toward reconciliation. Because it's only by being uncomfortable for a period of time that change can really happen. And just this idea that discomfort has to be a bad thing, if somehow we can overcome that. I mean, there's some people who are racist just because that's where their hearts are, and that's not going to change. God himself is going to have to change that. But I don't think that's everybody. And some people just don't want to have the conversation because they don't want to be uncomfortable. If we can get people who are like that, who if we can convince them that you don't have to be uncomfortable, then I feel that more conversations can be had, and then we can move forward.
You're saying convince them that they don't have to be uncomfortable?
No, not. I'm sorry if that's what I said. That is not what I meant. I guess convincing people that there's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable and to lean into your discomfort for the purpose of moving forward.
Oh, okay.
I think even the focus on comfort is insulting to me. I, as a Black woman, have spent the past 3 or 4 weeks broken. And so I think these people who are uncomfortable need to consider that there's nothing like the discomfort of over 400 years of painful, violent, state-sponsored oppression. That's discomfort.
Amen.
And I think that I just to be in a situation here and now where we're having this discussion, I was looking really forward to coming here and hearing from others, not from people who look like me, who live this every day and who know this. I want to hear from other people who are really in a position to be able to change this, because this isn't something, first of all, it's not fixable, right? We're not talking about a system that can be fixed. We're talking about a system that needs to be destroyed and rebuilt. And that cannot be done by Black people because it's not something that we created. And I think, the discussion needed to include, I was looking forward to hearing from the voices of others who are in a position to be able to say, I'm going to go to my white pastor who doesn't agree with this. And even the issue of not agreeing, what does he not agree with? Do you agree? Are you thinking that, to me, the whole all lives matter versus Black lives matter is about me affirming my humanity. That's an insult. Think of how painful that is for people. I don't know how you could call yourself a Christian and you're asking people to affirm their humanity. And your response is, nope, no can do. Can't affirm your humanity. Nope. It lets me know I know where the God is in that. There's no question for me.
I'm
ahead.
sorry.
No, you.
I just was going to say, I agree with my sisters on here, but I do disagree with one thing Sherri said, and that is that we do not serve the same God. We do not read the same Bible, and we do not share the same theology. If your theology in any way can affirm that I am not as human as you, and I am not a creation such as you, based on this ridiculous logic of Ham being cursed and the stupidity of taking scriptures about slavery completely out of historical context and trying to fit them into a shoe that doesn't fit today, that's just idiocy at its best. And so I do not ever suggest that I serve that same God. Jason and I have had these conversations many of times because as you know, he told you we've been friends 30 something years. And so we talk very transparently about things. And it was a season in which, my boy was like, man, I'm not fooling with Christianity. And that was because of evangelicals. And I had to explain to Jason, evangelicals aren't Christians. It is a third party in America that is, under the canopy of Christianity, because you cannot tell me you have read the same scripture that says that there's a God who sacrificed his son for everyone. And you conclude that I still have to petition you for being defined as a person. I still have to beg you to ask you to consider me to matter. And then I'll say this last thing, and I'll tap out for a second. Jeanette and Bryan, I applaud you guys for having this call. But like Sandee said, I have been on and I'm not even doing a preacher exaggeration. You know, preachers, we exaggerate and make up large numbers, but literally probably 40 something calls like this in the last 2 weeks. And I have finally got to the point where I just said no, because you got these folk, and I don't speak to either of you because I don't know you like that. Jason vouched for you, so I trust you. But I know white folk that have been calling, asking, and you just want me on these conversations now because it's sexy. You want me on these conversations now because there's this pressure to look like you care. No, man, if you didn't care 2 months ago, don't care now. And let's just be honest about that. Mm-hmm. Because if you start asking me real questions, I'm going to give you real answers. You're not going to like the answers, and you're never going to want to fully change the system. You cannot. This is not something that you can remix a song. This ain't a remix. You can't just change the beat and add a new verse and think this is going to be okay. No, you need this is an entire new album that needs to be created. And the reality of it is this, white folk who are the producers of these albums don't want to redo the album. Nope. They're making too much money off of it. The white church is making too much money off of it. So they don't want to redo the album. They don't want to redo the contract. They don't want to give us our masters back. They like it just like it is. And so while I have no issue with the discomfort of these conversations and being transparent with any of my white brothers and sisters who genuinely want to engage in these dialogues, but if the whole of white America is not going to realize that this does not work biblically for all of people, then, you know, all of this stuff is symbolic. And that's the frustration for me with all of that. And this is from somebody who, you know, has a diverse church. It's the frustration of it for Black folk. That's when you get marching and protests and yelling and screaming and cursing. When you watch consistently a white person yell, scream, smack police officers, and manage to make it to jail, manage to make it in front of the judge, manage to get bail, manage to get an hour of community service at Dairy Queen, and we get pulled over for suspended license or sleeping in a drive-through, and you're dead. And then everybody just wants to talk about it. What are we talking about? Why is racism a debate?
And Daryl, I agree with you 100%. And it's, I guess I can use the word ironic. Today is the anniversary of the incident that happened in South Carolina. Dylan Roof made it out alive. George Floyd did not. I won't go into details because we're all educated people and we all have the same Google, like we should all have the same Bible. But those are two drastic situations where it tells you everything you need to know.
So one, probably more loaded than I intend it to be. One last question. Because as a white male, I'm still learning, and I'm okay admitting that. What would it take, what would it look like to deconstruct the church, to rebuild it as an anti-racist, actually gospel-centered movement of people?
To rebuild, you first have to tear down what was built incorrectly. To tear down the ideal of racism and the theology of racism in the church, and particularly the white church, somebody has to stand up and say, racism is wrong, racism is a sin. And somebody has to repent for healing to begin. Reconciliation isn't we all sit on a Zoom call and, oh, we're all friends and we're all connected and brothers and sisters in Christ. It's a very direct, racism is a sin. In this house of God, we do not condone that. And here's why. And pastors should be able to give the same theology out of the same Bible that we all read. If that doesn't happen, if you don't tear down what was built incorrectly, there is no progress. So white churches first have to admit the wrong and repent.
I think we have to also recognize that for as much as we proclaim Jesus being our Savior and we celebrate the resurrection, we are all afraid of resurrection because we're all afraid of dying. This institution as it exists needs to die But if we're resurrection people, then we shouldn't be afraid of how it dies or the fact that it dies, because on the other side of that is the only way that it's possible to have a church whose foundation is not replete with racism. So there's no other way to fix it. There is no ready solution. I think that we set ourselves up for great disappointment when we say, what's the way to fix it, or what is the solution, without first understanding what the process is. So overcoming a fear of this thing as we have it now dying for the possibility of something new to be born in its place is, for me, the first step. But that's a big step, getting people to admit, I celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, but I'm fearful of anything else being resurrected.
Any other thoughts? All right. So we didn't really talk a whole lot about church communication, and that's okay. I think these conversations, as uncomfortable as they are, is good to have, and I think it's healthy, and I believe that God is going to use it for His glory, and I hope that that many of the people that are part of this webinar right now, and the people that will be watching after we post it, I think that there's a lot to learn, a lot to listen, and hopefully some knowledge to gain from there. I also don't think that this is going to be the end of the conversation. So I'll reach out to each of you kind of individually after the webinar as far as our panelists go, because I'd love to continue this conversation at some level. But for all of you that have joined today, panelists, thank you. For everyone watching, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking part in this conversation. We still have a lot to learn, and pray that by God's glory we may make a difference. So any last comments or thoughts from the panel before we sign off?
Yeah, I got a last thought. My last thought is we talked about quite a few different things, and even with the some of the last changes that we need and stuff like that. I think that one of the things that we need to look at leaving out of here is, as we continue the conversation, to actually look at change. So not just hearing this and going back to things as usual. The normal is no longer even a valid word to use for a variety of reasons. But we're going to look at needing to vote differently. We need leadership change. We need a lot of different ways for, we saw all these Black Lives Matter posts coming from churches and from organizations and corporations, but we need actual tangible changes. And one of the things we've seen as of late is when you look at certain ways that religion and politics is tying in together, and the ways that certain people, specifically people have voted over the last 4 years or so, we need to see different types of changes in terms to look for different types of outcomes. But saying all these things, putting all these posts up, having all these talks, and then systemically doing the same things you did before, vote the same, and trying to have the same patterns, is not going to come with with any type of different outcome. We're just going to have the same outcome.
Yes, I did have one more thing I wanted to say. Bryan, you reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier when you mentioned that we didn't really get into the church communications aspect of it. And something that I was thinking about is, and I know there are a lot of people in the church communication space who also, follow the same person. But one of the people who has influenced my communications the most is actually not a church communicator. A lot of us know who Gary Vaynerchuk is, and just the influence that he's had on marketing. And one thing that he always says is he doesn't read books, even though he's written with the help of ghostwriters and the like, and the team of writers. He's written many New York Times bestsellers, books, and everything like that. He says he doesn't read books himself, but what he does is he reads the comments of the people who follow him on social media. He reads their comments, and he hears the tenor of conversations just to see what's going on, and sees how he needs to adjust his content, or how he can further conversations in different areas. And I wanted to say that in light of there's been, the common question these days has been, a lot of people, white people asking Black people, what resources can I, start looking at? What books can I start to read? And there, quite frankly, there's been a lot of Black people who have not necessarily wanted to answer this question, and will say it's not my responsibility or anything like that. And I don't disagree with anybody who necessarily says that. To people who say, yeah, you need to do your own research or something like that. But I did kind of want to add, I mean, you can look at the New York Times bestsellers list right now. You can look at the top books on Amazon right now and see some resources that you can definitely tap into that would help you to further your education in this area. But I would also recommend, in light of what I was just saying, just start listening and reading comments. Just go on Twitter and just start looking at different conversations from different people and see what they're talking about. Listen to the experiences of other Black people and read the experiences of other Black people and listen to our stories. Read the things that we've had to deal with. We're not exaggerating. Nobody's exaggerating. Nobody is trying to make things even worse than they have been. The people's comments or people's experiences and what people have dealt with, those are real experiences. And I think that you can get a lot of education just by consuming those experiences and learning what people have had to deal with, and learning just how valid people's perspectives are based on what they've dealt with. So I would just recommend that as part of your education, just to really listen and consume and read as much as possible other people's experiences and other people's perspectives on all forms of media. I think that would really be helpful.
And another resource I recommend people read is the Bible, and see how Jesus treated people, and keep in mind that Black people are included in that.
Kind of funny that you even have to mention that. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining again. Thank you for watching along. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, Bryan, Bryan, @churchjuice.com, and we can continue the conversation there. All right, have a good day, everyone.
Bye, guys.